Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, snow falls over a quiet village. A single candle flickers beside a secret long kept in silence. Are you listening late at night or during your morning tea? Light a candle, draw the curtains close, and let the mystery begin. Snow fell as though it had rehearsed its entrance slowly, politely, and without fuss. The village of St. Mary Mead received it with mild surprise, for it was a Sunday morning in December, and most of the inhabitants had expected rain, something that would match their damp hymns and well-intentioned murmurs. From her window in the small house on the lane, Miss Marple regarded the whitened roofs with the tranquil interest of someone watching manners unfold among strangers. There was the postman, trudging ahead of time so that he might finish before the roads froze again. There was Colonel Melchett's motor car, idling too long in front of the vicarage, its exhaust like a puffing pipe that would not quite draw. And there, beneath the churchyard yew, two small children pressed their mittened hands against the memorial stones to see whose name felt colder. The world, Miss Marple thought, was never lovelier or more deceptive than when covered in white. At 10:30, the bell of St. Clement's rang with the modest conviction of duty, calling the faithful and the merely curious. Within the pews, scarves steamed faintly, and whispers clustered like breath upon glass. The Reverend Leonard Clement, his spectacles misted, preached on forgiveness. His wife, Griselda, yawned behind her prayer book and thought of the ham that must not over-roast. Nothing remarkable disturbed the ritual, save perhaps the absence of Mrs. Lavinia Dorset, whose fondness for public piety was as dependable as her turquoise brooch. It was Mrs. Price Ridley who mentioned it first, leaning toward Miss Marple as though sharing liturgy. "My dear Jane, have you noticed? Lavinia Dorset isn't here, and she never misses Advent. One begins to wonder about illness or something less respectable." Miss Marple's blue eyes flickered from the hymn-board to the door. "Perhaps merely the weather," she said mildly, "though the Dorset fire always burns high enough to melt a small blizzard." The remark was gentle, but Mrs. Price Ridley received it as an invitation. "I dare say the lady's hospitality burns higher than her fire, if you take my meaning. One hears the most peculiar stories about that new lodger of hers, a nephew, they call him." The organ sighed into its final chord, dismissing both sermon and speculation. Yet the whisper had already threaded through the congregation. By the time the collection plate made its last circuit, at least 4 versions of Mrs. Dorset's absence had taken from each more tragic or scandalous than the next. Gossip, Miss Marple reflected, was much like candlelight. It softened cruelty while enlarging shadows. After the service, snow thickened. The villagers dispersed under umbrellas shaped like miniature observances of class. The colonel's chauffeur held one for his wife. The grocer's boy used a newspaper. Miss Marple walked home unhurriedly, her boots making a soft grammar in the snow. Near the vicarage gate, she paused. A small envelope lay half-buried at the edge of the path-cream paper, heavy, sealed with a blot of scarlet wax that had cracked cleanly in 2. No address, only a faint scent of lavender and smoke. She hesitated, gloved fingers hovering. One did not pick up other people's letters, yet one could not very well leave private correspondence melting into slush. She placed it in her reticule, intending to hand it to the postman. Still, something about that was broken, yet deliberately stayed in her thoughts. By noon, the village looked bewitched beneath its snow. Chimneys trailed silver smoke windows, glowed like watchful eyes. Inside her parlor, Miss Marple set a pot of tea upon the table and listened to the tick of the clock, that small negotiator between order and accident. The envelope rested beside her teacup, damp at the corners. She resisted curiosity for nearly 7 minutes, then surrendered not by opening it, but by examining its seal under lamplight. The crack had formed a curious pattern, almost like the outline of a candle's flame. She smiled at herself. You're fanciful, Jane. Entirely fanciful. At 12:30, Griselda Clement arrived, cheeks flushed and moral conviction somewhat melted by weather. Jane, you haven't heard, have you? They found poor Lavinia Dorset. She stopped, aware of her own dramatic pause. In the drawing room, the fire out, the door locked, and the vicar says, "Oh dear, I don't know how to say it properly. She's quite dead." Miss Marple rose, calm as always, though the air seemed suddenly to contract around the ticking clock. "Dead?" "Frozen," whispered Griselda. "They say the window was open, and there was a candle still burning on the mantelpiece. Isn't that queer?" Queer indeed, thought Miss Marple, as the flame of the candle in her own room shivered without breeze. Within the hour, Constable Lake had cycled through the snow to summon Dr. Haydock, and half the village had positioned itself behind lace curtains to observe tragedy at an agreeable distance. The Dorset's house, halfway down Old Mill Lane, wore its frost like guilt. A group of neighbors stood outside pretending to be helpful. Inside, whispers already sought meaning. Some said heart failure, others poison, one hinted faintly at remorse. But Miss Marple, who had walked quietly to the gate, noticed something. None of them did the trail of boot prints that approached the door, stopped and did not return. Snow preserved indiscretion far better than memory. She turned back toward her cottage, her breath pale against the afternoon. Somewhere in her reticule, the broken sealed letter seemed to weigh more than paper should. Miss Marple paused at her gate and looked up at the lowering sky. It was the kind of silence, she thought, that only came before truth began to speak. The silence Miss Marple had noticed was soon broken by the uneven chime of the church clock. Somewhere behind the vicarage hedge a dog barked, startled by voices that should have been quieter. Word of Mrs. Dorset's death spread faster than reason could catch it. By the time Miss Marple had placed her gloves neatly on the hall table, Griselda's news had rippled through the high street and into the back parlor of the Blue Boar. There it was translated, embroidered, and served with sherry. At first, grief wore the mask of helpfulness. Mrs. Price Ridley appeared at the Dorset gate with a basket of sandwiches she had not been asked to bring. Miss Hartnell volunteered to straighten the cushions. Even old Mr. Petherick, who had once lost a glove on Mrs. Dorset's front steps, insisted on keeping watch over the lane. They were not cruel, Miss Marple reflected. Merely human, they needed to be near whatever had upset their idea of order. Inside, the drawing-room smelt faintly of extinguished wax. A single chair had been pulled close to the hearth, and on the carpet the pattern of soot where something heavy had fallen. Dr. Haydock, his spectacles fogged by breath, spoke low to the constable. Heart failure, perhaps. Exposure. Although one wonders why she opened the window on a morning like this. Or who opened it for her, murmured the constable, glancing toward the sill where snow had gathered in a thin arc, as if tracing an entry. Miss Marple did not intrude. She stood near the door, her eyes following the flame of the half-burnt candle still standing on the mantelpiece. Its wax had run unevenly, spilling down one side in hardened tears. Such things, she thought, often said more than the faces of those alive. When the coroner's cart rattled away, the village exhaled. The sound of wheels on frozen ruts carried like a sermon through the streets. Within the hour, the talk turned practical. Who would arrange the funeral? Who might inherit the house? Who exactly was this nephew who had come only 3 months earlier and lodged in the East Room? Some remembered him as quiet, others as ill-tempered. Mrs. Price Ridley remembered him as overly polite, which amounts to the same thing. At tea, the vicar attempted a tone of calm pastoral duty. "We mustn't speculate," he said, adding sugar with excessive precision. "Let the authorities do their work." Griselda stirred her cup with less restraint. "Authorities? My dear, they think authority begins and ends with a clipboard. It's the smallest oddities that matter, like that window and the candle. Who keeps a candle lit in daylight? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps she feared the dark was coming sooner than it should. It was an answer, but not the kind to close a conversation. The Reverend looked relieved to have something he could translate into sermon. Griselda looked unsatisfied, which in her case meant intrigued. When she left, she promised to pop over to the Dorset place tomorrow, meaning she would find out everything before tea. As dusk arrived, the snow changed its sound, softer, more secretive. From her window, Miss Marple watched lights flicker in one cottage after another. Beneath such lamps, suspicions multiplied like shadows in lamplight. She noted small gestures, Mrs. Price. Ridley hurried along with her collar up, Mr. Petherick pretending to check his gate latch twice, the postman pausing by the telephone kiosk, though he had no letters left to post. Fear, Miss Marple knew, did not always announce itself loudly. It simply altered the rhythm of habits. At 7, there came a knock, tentative, half ashamed. When she opened the door, a young woman stood there, the cold turning her cheeks into feverish roses. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. I'm Alice Dorset, Aunt Lavinia's niece. Miss Marple ushered her in gently. Not intruding at all, my dear. You must be chilled. Sit by the fire. The girl obeyed, her hands trembling as she removed her hat. They say it was natural causes, but it can't be. She wasn't ill. She'd written to me just last week, saying she had something important to tell me. About a will. Miss Marple poured tea, careful not to hurry her. And this nephew who stayed with her? Alice's face changed. Cousin Gerald. He came from somewhere abroad, Canada, I think. Aunt never spoke of him until he arrived. He handled her correspondence these past months. Miss Marple stirred her cup, eyes lowered. Did he post them too? I suppose so. Why? Oh, only that the postman's been unusually early these days. An early post, in my experience, often hides late motives. Alice blinked, uncertain whether that was wisdom or warning. She sipped her tea, then produced a small folded note from her handbag. This was on her writing desk. The police said it was nothing a list of names, but look. In neat, slanted script were 3 words. Snow, candle, secret. Beneath them, a line drawn twice as though underlining a decision. Miss Marple studied it under the lamp. She was a woman of method, your aunt. A list like this might be memory or fear. She did not add that it echoed too perfectly the letter she'd found on the path, the one sealed with broken red wax. The clock struck 8. Outside, snow thickened again, erasing footprints faster than truth could follow. Miss Marple walked to the window, where reflection and night merged like faces in disguise. In one pane, she saw her own calm profile, in another, the uncertain eyes of the girl. Appearances, she thought, were always polite until someone tried to see through them. Miss Marple, said Alice softly, do you think she was murdered? Miss Marple did not turn. I think, she said, that people are rarely killed for reasons strangers would understand. But sometimes, my dear, the surface of respectability is thinner than we believe. The girl shivered. You make it sound as if the whole village knows something. Miss Marple's smile was kind, almost maternal. Oh, they do. They just don't know that they know it yet. In the hearth, the fire sank lower, a red eye behind its veil of ash. Miss Marple watched it flicker and fade, remembering the candle by the dead woman's chair. A flame unattended, yet not accidental. As the clock marked the hour, a distant sound broke the hush, the rattle of a bicycle bell and a hurried knock upon the vicarage door. Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the window, where a single point of light still trembled across the lane, refusing to die out. The light across the lane trembled once more and vanished, as though extinguished by a hand that did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple stood at her window until the faint echoes of the bicycle bell dwindled into the hush of falling snow. Somewhere in the vicarage, a door closed hurriedly. She did not move for several moments. It was her habit to let silence settle before deciding what it meant. Then, with a small sigh, she set the folded note marked "Snow, Candle, Secret" beside the sealed envelope she had found that morning. Two mysteries, she thought, might yet belong to one truth. The next morning, the village looked as though it had been freshly laundered and hung out to freeze. Even scandal seemed to move more slowly in such brightness. Constable Lake, his uniform a shade darker than the snow about him, was already knocking on doors in Old Mill Lane. The local paperboy trailed behind, pretending to deliver news he was gathering instead. At the Dorset house, a small group had assembled. Dr. Haydock, the vicar, and Colonel Melchett stood in uneasy consultation while a stranger in a dark coat took notes in a little book. This, Miss Marple learned from Griselda, was Inspector Fletcher from Melchester, a practical man, keen on solid facts and unimpressed by the softer texture of village truths. Miss Marple, arriving under the pretext of returning a borrowed hymn book, was waved inside. Fletcher gave her a polite nod that concealed mild impatience. "We're establishing a timeline, madam," he said briskly. "Mrs. Dorset was last seen alive by her maid at 10 last evening. Window open, fire still burning. Found this morning by the maid again, the door locked from inside, key missing. No signs of struggle." "Locked rooms," murmured the vicar, "are rather fashionable, I suppose." "Not to the victim, sir," said Fletcher dryly. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the table near the hearth. A silver candlestick remained there, its twin empty, its wax cold and bent at one side. She said nothing, only observed how the wax had cooled in an unnatural curve, as though the candle had been snuffed too quickly and relit. The maid, a pale creature named Elsie, stood wringing her apron. She'd been restless these last days, sir, talking to herself, sometimes writing notes, and that cousin Mr. Gerald's was in and out at all hours. Said he was arranging her accounts. "Accounts?" asked Miss Marple, lightly. "How considerate of him." The girl hesitated, glancing toward the inspector. She didn't trust banks, ma'am. Kept money in boxes, tins and drawers. I saw him near one once. He said he was tidying. Inspector Fletcher noted something down. "And where is this cousin now?" "When I went out before breakfast," the maid stammered. "Said he needed air." Miss Marple caught Dr. Haydock's look of half-skepticism, half-pity. She knew that kind of air often contained more than oxygen. Still, she merely adjusted her scarf and studied the frost forming inside the window pane. Its delicate shapes reminded her of letters never sent. When the questioning ended, the inspector turned to her with professional courtesy. "You knew the deceased well, Mrs. Marple. Jane Marple." "Not intimately, Inspector, but sufficiently to know her fondness for other people's affairs." She smiled, a faint twinkle at odds with her words. "And for lavender wax, which she used for her sealing. Odd, isn't it, that I should have found a letter with such a seal on the lane yesterday morning?" The room's attention shifted toward her. Fletcher straightened. "You found a letter? Where?" "Near the vicarage gate. Broken seal, no address. I assumed it had fallen from someone's pocket. May I see it?" She opened her handbag and offered the envelope. The inspector turned it under the light, frowning. "No contents?" "None," she said. "Only the impression of paper once folded inside, faint but visible under lamplight. Whoever removed it did so with care." Fletcher's tone softened slightly. "You have a sharp eye, Miss Marple. It's merely that I have known too many people who hide things in plain sight," she replied. He gave a short laugh. "Well, you may leave detection to us, but keep those eyes open. It's usually the ordinary details that matter. I find the ordinary almost always conceals the extraordinary," she said gently. By afternoon, the Dorset house was sealed, and the village resumed its habitual rhythm of civility and whispers. At the grocer's, someone remembered that Mrs. Dorset had quarrelled with her solicitor. At the post office, a clerk recalled a telegram sent under a false name. Each story contradicted the next, yet all agreed upon one sentiment: it couldn't happen here. Miss Marple, knitting in her parlour, listened to the rhythm of the needles. Each stitch, she thought, was like gossip connected to another, making a pattern no one saw until the end. Alice Dorset came again at dusk, her eyes reed-rimmed but determined. "They've found nothing, Miss Marple. No poison, no sign of breaking, but there's no trace of it. She told me she'd rewritten it only last week." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And who drew it up?" "Mr. Peabody, her solicitor in Melchester. He says she never sent it back for filing. Then perhaps it's still here somewhere." Miss Marple rose and went to the mantel. The candle stub remained, a droplet of hardened wax glistening near its base. If one wished to hide something in a house full of watchers, she mused, one would choose the place everyone sees, yet no one questions. Alice looked confused. "You mean?" Miss Marple lifted the candlestick, turned it over, and tapped lightly at its base. A dull click answered. The bottom slid away, revealing a narrow slit of folded paper within. She replaced it at once and set the candlestick back, unaltered. "I think, my dear," she said quietly, "you should tell Inspector Fletcher to examine this more carefully, and say nothing of where the thought came from." Alice stared at her, startled by the composure that accompanied revelation. "You knew?" "I only wondered," Miss Marple replied, smoothing her sleeve. "How far appearances might protect a secret. Candles, after all, were made to give light, not to hide what burns beneath." The girl's eyes followed the flicker of the fire, now dimming to embers. A soft creak came from the front gate. Miss Marple's head turned slightly toward the sound, alert without seeming so. The footsteps that followed were slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to the postman. The knock at Miss Marple's gate came again, measured, decisive, belonging to someone who believed that privacy yielded to authority. Miss Marple rose without haste, allowing her knitting to rest in the armchair like an unfinished conversation. When she opened the door, Inspector Fletcher stood there, collar dusted with snow, expression halfway between courtesy and resolve. "Evening, Miss Marple. I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to ask a few follow-up questions." "Of course, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "Investigations are rather like parish teas. Someone must keep refilling the pot." He stepped inside, brushing snow from his sleeve. His eyes caught the faint gleam of the candlestick on the mantel, but passed over it without pause. "We've had a development. Mr. Gerald Dorset returned about an hour ago. Says he was walking out past the Downs when he heard of his aunt's death. But we've reason to believe he left earlier than he claims." Miss Marple poured tea while he spoke. "Oh dear. I imagine time runs differently when one has something dreadful to explain." Fletcher gave a brief smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He's in custody for the moment, not charged, just detained. The maid swears she saw him slip a parcel into the coal shed late last night. We found nothing there, of course, except a few old ashes." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Ashes are very honest things. They never pretend to be what they were." The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. "You've seen enough of human nature to know how it goes. A man without employment, living off a relative, opportunity at hand. We've found she withdrew £50 in cash last week. It's missing." £50, repeated Miss Marple, stirring her cup. "Buys a great deal of guilt, even if one never spends it." Fletcher leaned forward. "You doubt his guilt?" "I've learned to doubt almost everything, Inspector, except knitting patterns and the vicar's sermons. They never change." He laughed softly, then sobered. "Well, if he didn't do it, he's doing a fine impression." Says he was fond of her, but people don't usually take evening strolls in snowstorms. He can't account for 2 hours. Miss Marple listened, her eyes moving to the front-searched window. Beyond the glass, the lane gleamed pale, moonlight spreading over it like dust on forgotten silver. Somewhere down that lane, the village was settling into its newest certainty. Gerald Dorset, the wastrel nephew, had done it. It was neat, comprehensible, and therefore comforting. When Fletcher left, promising to keep her informed, Miss Marple did not sit down. Instead, she took her small torch and stepped into the garden. Snow muffled her steps. Across the hedge, she could see the faint glow from the Dorsets' house, one window still lit, others black. She watched it for a long minute before returning indoors. By morning, the news had ripened. At the grocer's, Mrs. Price Ridley was describing Gerald Dorset's dark looks and foreign temper. At the post office, Miss Hartnell declared she had always distrusted men who smoked foreign cigarettes. Even the vicar, though kindly, admitted over breakfast that appearances are regrettably consistent with guilt. Griselda, buttering toast, replied, "Appearances are never consistent with anything, dear. They merely happen to fit until something uglier comes along." Miss Marple, visiting with her knitting basket, smiled approvingly. "How true, my dear. The world does love a simple story. It saves so much thinking." At noon, Alice Dorset came to her again, eyes pale from a sleepless night. "They say he'll be charged, Miss Marple. Gerald swears he's innocent. He said Aunt Lavinia gave him that money to pay the rates, but they can't find any proof. Did your aunt often trust him with such things?" Alice hesitated. "I don't know. She used to be careful, almost secretive. Then suddenly she seemed to depend on him. It was odd, as if she wanted to prove something to herself." "People sometimes do," Miss Marple said softly. "Especially those who suspect they've been deceived before." Alice's gaze dropped to the fire, which burned low and quiet. "He can be charming, you know, but he has a terrible temper when provoked. Still, I can't believe he'd harm her." Miss Marple rose and fetched the kettle. "Belief, my dear, is like candlelight. It comforts, but it also blinds. Better to ask what shadows it hides." That afternoon, Inspector Fletcher called again. Brisker now. "We've found something, Miss Marple." In the ash bucket outside the Dorset kitchen, a metal fragment, curved like part of a key, burnt nearly through. "Ah," said Miss Marple, "then the lock that kept the door shut may have been opened from within or by artifice." He frowned. "It supports our theory. He locked her in, escaped through the window, then burnt the key to destroy evidence." "Does it?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "I should think it supports only the existence of fire and metal. The rest is imagination." "Imagination," said Fletcher, "is the beginning of deduction. And sometimes the end of it too," she murmured. That evening, as the light waned to pewter, Miss Marple took her walk past Old Mill Lane. The constable nodded at her, but said nothing. She was by now a familiar figure in moments of crisis. Snow had been swept from the Dorset path, revealing the flagstones beneath. She paused near the gate and noticed something curious, a line of footprints leading not toward the door, but around the house to the back garden's molar prints, precise and not yet obscured by fresh fall. She followed them with quiet care until they vanished near a bench half buried in snow. On its seat lay a crushed object, a small red candle, half burnt, its wick blackened. She picked it up delicately. Lavender scent. Mrs. Dorset's. As she turned it in her palm, a sound reached her from inside the house. A raised voice, male, angry, then abruptly cut short. She replaced the candle where she'd found it and stepped back into the shadows. Through the frost-glazed window she glimpsed Gerald Dorset speaking to the inspector, his face pale, movements sharp with denial. The flame of guilt, Miss Marple thought, always flares brightest when the truth draws near. She turned away as a gust of wind snuffed the lantern on the porch, leaving the house in sudden darkness. A silence followed, too long and too deliberate to be peaceful. The darkness seemed to settle like breath upon glass, faintly trembling, but never dispersing. Miss Marple lingered just beyond the garden hedge, her figure blurred against the snow. Inside the house, the voices rose again, Inspector Fletcher's firm, measured tone and Gerald Dorset's, taut with indignation. Then came the scrape of a chair and the muffled closing of a door. A moment later, light flared briefly as if someone had reopened the shutter. It caught upon the frosted window and then dimmed again. Miss Marple retraced her steps along the path, careful not to disturb the fresh snow that preserved every story a little too faithfully. She carried with her the faint scent of lavender wax from the red candle she had replaced, an echo of something that did not yet make sense. Candles, keys, sealed envelopes, and lists of 3, snow, candle, secret. The pattern was too deliberate to be chance, but the meaning still lay just beyond comprehension, like handwriting glimpsed through water. The next morning brought no peace. Word spread that Gerald Dorset had been formally accused of obstructing the investigation. His temper, when questioned further, had given the inspector reason to detain him again. Villagers took this as confirmation of guilt. Even the vicar's sermon that day hinted delicately at the perils of self-deception and sudden wrath. In the pew behind Miss Marple, Mrs. Price Ridley whispered to Miss Hartnell, "Mark my words, it was money and pride. Always is." After the service, the 2 women lingered on the church porch, arranging their shawls with unnecessary diligence to better intercept information. Miss Marple, passing them with polite warmth, heard just enough to note what they did not say. No one spoke of Mrs. Dorset herself, only of the scandal her death had left behind. It was as though the woman had vanished not into snow, but into gossip. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage under the pretext of returning a book. The Clements were by the fire, Griselda knitting and the Reverend rereading his notes for the evening service. On the table beside them lay the newspaper, its headline blunt as a confession, "Nephew questioned in aunt's death village in shock." "I suppose we must appear in the next edition," Griselda said dryly. "They always need respectable faces for moral framing." The vicar sighed. If only people would wait for facts before judgment. "Facts," Miss Marple observed softly, "arrive after people have decided what they prefer to believe. It's very inconvenient for the truth." Griselda set down her needles. "And what do you believe, Jane?" "I believe," she replied, "that one cannot lock a room so neatly without meaning to mislead, and that Mrs. Dorset was far too fond of appearances to choose such a messy end." The vicar looked troubled. "You think she was killed, then?" Miss Marple gave a small shrug. "Killed, deceived, or frightened into silence, it's difficult to tell the difference until one sees what frightened her." That evening, a storm gathered again. Snow drifted past the lamplight in diagonal strokes, and the wind played against the eaves like a bow drawn over thin strings. Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle in her lap. Across the lane, the Dorset house stood dark, save for a faint glimmer in an upper window. It was there she noticed a silhouette crossing the room, pausing, then bending as though searching. A second figure followed, taller, heavier, unmistakably the inspector's. The light vanished moments later. The next morning, Fletcher arrived looking unusually subdued. "We've uncovered something odd, Miss Marple. I'd value your thoughts, unofficially, of course." He produced from his pocket a small metal trinket wrapped in paper. It was a brooch, delicate and old-fashioned, shaped like a lily, one petal slightly bent. Found it in the ashes of the hearth. Though at first it was melted silver, the girl identified it. Mrs. Dorset wore it pinned to her shawl at supper. Miss Marple examined it carefully. The pins broken, torn, not unclasped. Exactly. And the ashes weren't from last night's fire. The doctor says the heat marks suggest something burnt after she was already dead. She turned the brooch over in her palm, watching how the light caught on its curve. So the fire was relit, to destroy something. Perhaps the will, Fletcher said grimly, though I'd expect more than a brooch for evidence. Perhaps not, Miss Marple said quietly. A woman like Mrs. Dorset would never destroy a symbol without reason. This peace lily of the valley, is it not? It signifies the return of happiness. Curious choice for her. Fletcher frowned. You mean sentiment? Or irony? She murmured. A final message, maybe, if one knew how to read it. He sighed, clearly skeptical, and departed to take further statements. Miss Marple watched him go, then took up the brooch again. Beneath the tarnish, she saw a faint smear of wax, almost invisible lavender wax. Her fingers tightened slightly around the metal, as if it might warm under thought. By mid-afternoon, she made her way to the post office. Mrs. Price Ridley was there, naturally, discussing the latest with Miss Hartnell. Both paused as Miss Marple entered, polite but alert, like cats interrupted mid-prowl. My dear Jane, Mrs. Price Ridley began such dreadful business, and to think I had tea with poor Lavinia only last Thursday. She was perfectly cheerful. Too cheerful, perhaps. Indeed, Miss Marple replied. Did she speak of her nephew? Oh, only to say he was settling the household accounts. Though she did mention something odd, said she'd finally found courage to seal it. I thought she meant her letters. Miss Marple inclined her head. Most likely. Courage is needed for many small acts. When she returned home, dusk had drawn its veil over the village. She placed the brooch beside the cracked envelope on her writing desk, the two glints of lavender wax catching faint lamplight. They seemed to belong to the same story, two halves of a conversation interrupted mid-sentence. She sat back, eyes narrowing slightly as the snow pressed against the window pane. Somewhere between the letter with no words and the candle that would not die lay the truth that had been carefully lit, then hidden again before it could burn too brightly. And as she reached to snuff her own candle for the night, her hand stopped halfway, arrested by the reflection of the flame in the window. The shape it cast was not round, but narrow, pointed like a key turned in a lock. The reflection of the key-shaped flame lingered in the window pane, thin and quivering. Miss Marple did not snuff it out. Instead, she sat back in her chair and listened to the silence that filled the room between the clicks of the clock. Somewhere in that silence, she thought, a confession was waiting, though not necessarily from the guilty. The following morning brought the inspector once more to her doorstep. He looked weary, his usual precision dulled by frustration. "We've had a new complication," he said without preamble. "The will's turned up after all." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows just enough to be polite. "That is good news, surely." "Depends who you ask." Fletcher took a folded document from his coat. "It names the niece, Miss Alice Dorset, as sole heir. The cousin has left nothing. Seems convenient, doesn't it? He claims it's a forgery. But the signature matches. Dates peculiar, though same day as the death." Miss Marple gestured him toward the hearth. "That would explain a good many things, Inspector. Death has a most inconsiderate habit of arriving at inconvenient times." Fletcher ignored the irony. She couldn't have signed it if she was already gone. But the paper was hidden, wedged behind a clock on the mantel. Makes one wonder who put it there, and when. She poured tea, letting the steam blur her expression. One must also wonder who wanted it to be found so quickly. The inspector hesitated. "You suspect the niece?" "I suspect human nature," said Miss Marple. "It has a remarkable tendency to look innocent when watched." Later that day, Miss Marple found Alice Dorset waiting outside the vicarage, pale and tight-lipped. "They think I forged it," she said without greeting. "Fletcher asked me if I knew her handwriting, as if I'd write something like that. My dear, People rarely believe innocence unless it's untidy, Miss Marple said gently. Tell me, did your aunt confide anything about that will? She only said she meant to put things right, that she'd been wrong about a person, though she didn't say who. Miss Marple noted the phrasing. Did she seem frightened? No resolution, as if she'd finally decided on something. They walked together along the lane. The snow had melted slightly, leaving dull patches of ice. In front of the Dorset gate, Miss Marple paused. Your aunt was a woman who disliked loose ends. If she truly changed her will, she would also ensure someone knew why. Alice frowned. Then who? Perhaps the person she feared most, Miss Marple murmured. One always tells the truth to the person one least trusts. It feels safer that way. Inside the house, Inspector Fletcher was questioning the maid again. Miss Marple stood quietly by the window, eyes straying toward the writing desk. Something about it seemed altered, papers neatly stacked, the ink bottle capped. Too neat, she thought, for a household recently visited by tragedy. Elsie, she asked gently, did you tidy your mistress's desk after she was found? The maid shook her head. No, ma'am. The inspector said not to touch a thing. But Mr. Dorset, he was in here before the constable came, said he was fetching a coat. Miss Marple glanced at Fletcher, who muttered an oath. He said he never entered the room again. Well, Miss Marple said, memory is a creature of convenience, Inspector. It comes and goes as needed. She approached the desk and examined the blotter. Its surface bore faint imprints of shapes of letters written and torn away. Tilting it toward the window, she traced the outline of 2 words. Not him. Beneath, a broken flourish, as though the pen had caught midway through signing. The inspector leaned closer. Good Lord, she was writing something. Perhaps a note. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps correcting herself. People who change their wills often change their minds as well. Fletcher straightened, perplexed. Then you think she intended to disinherit him but didn't finish? I think, said Miss Marple, that she may have realized too late who had misled her. A sound from the hallway cut the moment's short footsteps, rapid and uneven. Gerald Dorset appeared in the doorway, his face pale, eyes feverish. You're wasting your time, he shouted. It's all a game to you, isn't it? An old woman dies, and you pick over her life like crows. The inspector moved toward him, but Miss Marple's voice stopped both men. Games are rarely played alone, Mr. Dorset, and some are played long before one knows they've begun. He turned on her, breathing hard. You think I killed her? I think, she said mildly, that you loved yourself too much to love anyone else. That's not the same as murder, but it does make for bad alibis. For a heartbeat, silence returned, the kind that holds breath and watches faces. Then Dorset laughed sharply and left, slamming the door behind him. When he was gone, the inspector said under his breath, He'll break soon. Miss Marple shook her head. People who shout seldom do. It's the quiet ones who tell the truth without meaning to. That evening, she sat again in her parlor, the brooch and envelope before her. Her knitting lay untouched. The needles seemed too loud. The reflection of the candle wavered, elongating into 2 thin points that crossed like blades. She leaned closer, thoughtful. Appearances, she mused, often cut both ways. What protects also conceals. And somewhere beneath all this courtesy, someone had been watching, waiting for the village to choose the wrong villain. Outside, a figure paused by her gatesmall, cautious, wrapped in a grey shawl. Miss Marple did not move. She simply watched the faint shape hesitate, then disappear into the snow's hush, leaving only the echo of footsteps that did not belong to guilt, but to fear. Snow softened the sound of retreating footsteps until they vanished completely, leaving only the faint hiss of wind along the lane. Miss Marple remained at the window, eyes narrowed in quiet thought. Whoever had paused at her gate had done so with hesitation, not menace. Fear, she reflected, never moved in straight lines. It circled back upon itself, uncertain of its destination. Moments later, the knock came, light but urgent. When she opened the door, Alice Dorset stood there, cheeks flushed from cold and anxiety. "Miss Marple, forgive me if something's happened. They've just found another note in Aunt Lavinia's house. It wasn't there before." Miss Marple ushered her in, closing the door softly behind. "My dear, start from the beginning." Alice pressed a trembling hand to her coat pocket and withdrew a small folded sheet, its edges damp from snow. "Inspector Fletcher gave me permission to look through the linen chest for my aunt's ring. I found this wedged beneath the lining. It's in her handwriting." She handed it over with a mixture of dread and relief. "Read it, please." Miss Marple set her spectacles and unfolded the paper. The note was brief, written in sharp, deliberate strokes. "If he asks for forgiveness, refuse. He thinks I do not know." Beneath, the initials LD and a faint Marcan impression shaped like the edge of a candlestick base. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "When did you find it?" "Just an hour ago. Inspector Fletcher doesn't know yet. I wanted your opinion first." "It sounds like Gerald, doesn't it?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "But guilt seldom writes its own name. It lets others supply it." Alice's eyes searched hers desperately. Then who else could she mean? Miss Marple folded the note carefully. "That is what we must ask ourselves, and also, why leave such a message in a place meant to be found only after her death?" Outside, the storm had resumed, snow spiraling like unspent words. Miss Marple decided to walk with Alice back to the Dorset house before calling the inspector. The night was heavy with a peculiar silence, the sort that holds breath before confession. Lamps burned faintly behind curtained windows. The rest of the village lay sealed in its own comfortable ignorance. At the Dorset gate, Constable Lake emerged from the shadow, stamping his boots. "Evening, Miss Marple. The inspector's gone to Melchester, something about the solicitor. Left me to watch the place." "How very conscientious," Miss Marple said. "We'll just look in for a moment. Miss Dorset has something important to show him when he returns." Inside, the air was colder than the snow outside. The fire had burned to embers, and the draught through the open chimney moaned softly, like a sigh disguised as wind. Miss Marple moved to the writing desk again, her eyes sweeping the room with that particular calm that saw too much. Something about the space felt altered, not just tidied, but rearranged, as if someone had tried to put everything right without knowing where it belonged. "Did you move anything, Alice?" "Only the drawer, to check for more papers." Miss Marple nodded absently. On the mantel, the clock ticked faintly, its hands stopped at 1/4 the hour of death. Beneath it, the second candlestick still stood, twin to the one that had hidden the will. She reached for it, running a finger along the base. It felt faintly oily, not from wax, but from something heavier. "Oil," she murmured. "Not candle grease. Lamp oil, perhaps." Alice frowned. "But there are no lamps here." "No," said Miss Marple, her voice tightening slightly. "There wouldn't be." She turned the candlestick over. A small indentation marked the base, an impression shaped exactly like the one on the note. The same hand had pressed both. Miss Marple's thoughts turned sharply. Someone had handled the candlestick after the death, someone with enough composure to replace it and wipe away the evidence, but careless enough to leave a trace of oil. She looked up at the mirror above the mantel. The glass reflected two faces, her own and Alice's, pale against the shadowed room. But there was something else, a faint smudge near the lower corner, as if a hand had steadied itself there while reaching upward. "Would you be so kind," she said softly, "as to fetch a handkerchief from my coat pocket?" Alice obeyed, and Miss Marple pressed the cloth against the smudge. When she lifted it, the faint outline of a thumb appeared dark, sticky, smelling faintly of polish and paraffin. "Someone cleaned here recently," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, did your aunt employ anyone for the heavier work?" Alice hesitated. "Only Mrs. Sims, the charwoman. She came twice a week. And yesterday?" "No, she said she couldn't because of the snow." Miss Marple folded the handkerchief and slipped it away. "I see." Then someone else took it upon themselves to tidy a person anxious to erase a mistake. A sound interrupted her, the front latch turning slowly, then a hesitant voice calling, "Miss Dorset, are you there?" It was Mrs. Price Ridley. Alice stiffened. She must have followed us. She's been hovering all day. Miss Marple motioned for silence and opened the door halfway. "Good evening, Mrs. Price Ridley. What brings you out in this weather?" The woman looked embarrassed but curious. "I thought you might want company. One can't be too careful with all these goings-on." Miss Marple's smile was mild. "Indeed not. Come in, if you please. You've a talent for arriving when something is nearly discovered." Mrs. Price Ridley flushed. "Really, Miss Marple?" But her protest faltered as her gaze fell on the desk and the folded note beside it. Her expression changed subtly, something quick, defensive, and gone before it settled. Miss Marple saw it. So did Alice. "Oh," Mrs. Price Ridley said, recovering. "I only wanted to ask whether the vicar still intends the church bazaar next week." "Terrible timing, isn't it?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Timing is nearly everything." When she left, her footsteps vanished quickly under the falling snow. Miss Marple watched from the window until even her shadow dissolved into white. Alice turned toward her, uneasy. "You think she knows something?" "I think," Miss Marple said, eyes following the last swirl of flakes, "that Mrs. Price Ridley has been dusting more than her own furniture." In the hearth, one ember glowed, a small red eye beneath the ash. Miss Marple watched it pulse once, then fade, its last light vanishing like a memory hastily concealed. The last ember in the hearth gave its final flicker and died, leaving the room faintly perfumed with cold ash and lavender wax. Miss Marple stood a moment longer, her gaze steady on the spot where Mrs. Price Ridley's silhouette had vanished beyond the snow. The woman's intrusion had not been accidental, nor, Miss Marple suspected, had her interest in the letter. Appearances, once again, proved most energetic when guarding something ugly. Alice Dorset's voice broke the silence. "Do you really think she could have had anything to do with it?" "Mrs. Price Ridley? She's a gossip, yes, but not wicked," Miss Marple finished gently. "Wickedness is so seldom deliberate, my dear. It's usually tidiness gone wrong." She crossed to the writing desk, folded the note again, and slipped it into an envelope. Still, one must be careful before naming guilt. The truth often needs coaxing, like a shy visitor reluctant to step inside. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, and a small cascade of snow dropped from the roof with a soft sigh. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer. "Would you be brave enough, Miss Dorset, to help me with a small experiment?" Alice's reply came uncertainly. If it might clear Gerald's name, yes. "Oh, it may do more than that," Miss Marple said, her tone mild as milk. "But you must promise me discretion. People show themselves most clearly when they believe they're unobserved." By morning, the snow had hardened to a crisp white crust that crackled underfoot. The air held a deceptive clarity like glass. Beautiful, but brittle. Miss Marple sent out her invitations under the guise of practicality at a gathering at the vicarage to discuss the postponed bazaar. Nothing stirred village curiosity like the suggestion of decision-making, and by 3 o'clock the parlor was full. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived early, neat as a sermon and twice as certain of her importance. Miss Hartnell followed, bringing opinions instead of cakes. Even Inspector Fletcher made an appearance, having been politely summoned by Griselda, who adored theatricality. Miss Marple sat by the fire, needles moving rhythmically, her manner so calm that no one suspected she was waiting for tremors. Such dreadful business, Mrs. Price. Ridley began at once. The young man in custody, the niece under suspicion. Terrible for the village's reputation. Reputation, Miss Marple said softly, is a very delicate thing. It can be polished so often that one forgets what lies beneath. The inspector cleared his throat, puzzled but tolerant. If there's any useful gossip going round, perhaps we might hear it officially. Oh, I never gossip, Mrs. Price Ridley declared, smoothing her gloves. I merely repeat what everyone already knows, though between us, I've always thought Mrs. Dorset far too trusting. A woman like that invites trouble. Miss Marple's eyes never left her knitting. Yet trust, Mrs. Price Ridley, is not always foolish. Sometimes it's deliberate. The woman blinked. Deliberate? Indeed, a means of learning who might misuse it. Miss Marple let her needles pause, as if the thought had only just occurred. Do you recall, Mrs. Price Ridley, when you borrowed a silver frame from Mrs. Dorset for the church bazaar display? The one you returned rather late. Colour rose under the woman's powder. I had it polished first, a small courtesy. How kind, Miss Marple said. And while polishing, did you notice the photograph inside? A young woman in white, holding a candle. Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated. I may have. Why? Because Miss Marple continued gently, Mrs. Dorset mentioned it to me. She said someone had asked to borrow it again only last week. She refused, of course. Yet the frame vanished from her sideboard the day before her death. The silence that followed was sharper than the accusation. Fletcher leaned forward. Are you saying this woman Miss Marple raised a hand? I'm saying only that sentiment can be dangerous when confused with envy. Mrs. Dorset once told me the picture was not of herself, but of another woman who had been wronged long ago. She kept it as a reminder. Her gaze drifted to Mrs. Price Ridley, perhaps too visible a reminder for some. Mrs. Price Ridley's composure cracked and her mouth opened, then closed again. I don't know what you mean. Of course not, said Miss Marple pleasantly. No one ever does, until the moment they remember precisely where they were that evening. The inspector watched, eyes narrowing, as the woman began to speak again, rapidly, defensively claiming she'd seen Gerald Dorset near the post office, that she'd gone out only to deliver a note. Her voice trembled on that last word, and Miss Marple caught it like a dropped thread. A note, Mrs. Price Ridley, sealed, perhaps, with lavender wax. The woman's gloved hand twitched. I can't recall. Oh, I think you can, Miss Marple said, her voice almost tender. You see, that seal was broken when I found it by the vicarage gate. Curiously, the wax bore the same thumb mark as the polish I found on Mrs. Dorset's mirror. One always leaves a trace of one's good deeds. A faint gasp went through the room. Griselda, wide-eyed with fascination, set down her teacup too quickly. The inspector stood slowly. Are you accusing her, Miss Marple? Not at all, Miss Marple said, gathering her knitting. I'm merely observing that Mrs. Dorset trusted the wrong friend. She suspected too late that her confidences had been repeated elsewhere and perhaps used against her. Mrs. Price Ridley half rose from her chair. You can't prove anything. Miss Marple's tone remained serene. Nor would I wish to. Proof belongs to the police. But truth, my dear, belongs to conscience, and that is far harder to misplace. The woman faltered, then sank back down, trembling. The inspector motioned discreetly to his constable outside the door. Miss Marple watched it all with the gentle sadness of someone who had seen far too many performances end the same way. When the others had gone, Fletcher turned to her quietly. You set a trap. I prefer to think of it as an opportunity for truth to stretch its legs, she replied. Confession is rarely caught. It simply wanders into view when the light is right." He smiled reluctantly. "You've a knack for it, Miss Marple." She folded her knitting, eyes thoughtful. "Oh no, Inspector. I merely know that guilt, like candle wax, always melts toward the warmth it most fears." Outside, the snow began again, soft flakes dissolving upon the window glass. One settled briefly, its tiny shape perfect and unbroken, before vanishing into water. The snow continued to fall as if it meant to erase every path, every trace of the afternoon's small confessions. Miss Marple remained by the window after the inspector left, her reflection floating faintly against the glass, an elderly woman framed in firelight, knitting folded upon her lap, watching the world tidy itself too soon. She knew the pattern by heart. The village would sigh with satisfaction, believing the matter nearly concluded, and the wrong truth would harden like frost overnight. When she finally rose, it was not to rest, but to walk. Her candle cast a narrow ribbon of light along the lane, guiding her toward the Dorset house one last time. Snow muffled every sound but her own measured steps. She had told the inspector she wished to collect a small personal belonging, and he had nodded, too tired to object. That was how the best revelations began, in the quiet moments after authority had closed its notebook. Inside, the rooms held a stillness that was no longer mournful but expectant. The air smelled faintly of extinguished wax, a scent that had accompanied every clue. Miss Marple moved to the hearth, where the two candlesticks stood like sentinels, one concealing a will, the other a secret. Between them rested the clock hands, unmoved since death, its ticking long ceased. She bent to wind it, and the slow rhythm began again, a fragile heartbeat in a room that had seen too much pretense. She spoke softly into the silence, as if addressing the air. "You may as well come in, Inspector. I heard your boots outside some time ago." The door opened. Fletcher entered, cap in hand, expression cautious. "You always seem a step ahead of me, Miss Marple." "Only because I take smaller ones," she replied. "It gives me time to notice where others rush past." He smiled faintly. "We've enough evidence to keep Mrs. Price Ridley overnight. The wax, her fingerprints on the mirror, that letter. She claims she was protecting Mrs. Dorset's reputation." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Reputation, the neatest disguise ever stitched, but I wonder, Inspector, whether she was protecting it or polishing her own." Fletcher frowned. "You think she didn't kill her?" Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the candle flame. "Oh, I've no doubt she played a part, but murder, you see, rarely belongs to one person. It's usually a committee affair, made up of small kindnesses withheld, of secrets passed along too easily." He looked unconvinced. "We found the note she sent. It warns Mrs. Dorset to burn the papers before he finds them." Clear enough motive. "Indeed. Yet the note you found," Miss Marple said mildly, "was written on stationery from the vicarage, not her own. And Mrs. Price Ridley, for all her nosiness, would never steal church paper. Someone gave it to her." The inspector's face changed. "Who?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "someone who needed her to do precisely what she did, spread fear, deliver a message, misdirect suspicion. Someone who understood that respectability is the most obedient accomplice in the world." She lifted the clock from the mantel and turned it over. A small keyhole marked its base, faintly ringed with soot. "Do you recall, Inspector, the burnt metal fragment you found among the ashes? I wondered why a piece of key should have been destroyed unless it had first served its purpose." He leaned closer. "You mean this clock?" "I mean the person who wound it last," Miss Marple said, slipping a small brass key from her pocket, the kind used for both clocks and small locks. A practical little tool, this. Mrs. Dorset never touched it herself. She disliked the sound of ticking, so someone else must have kept it going. Fletcher's eyes widened. Her nephew? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, poor foolish Gerald. She let him wind it every night at 10. A small duty, meant to encourage responsibility, but someone clever knew that habit. They set the clock back 15 minutes on the evening she died, ensuring his last visit appeared earlier than it was. And after she was gone, they used his key to lock the door, breaking it in the fire to make his guilt seem perfect. The inspector exhaled. Good Lord. Miss Marple replaced the clock on the mantel. Mrs. Dorset had realized she'd been deceived, but not by her nephew. By another she trusted more. She wrote that list: snow, candle, secret as a memory aid. The snow to recall the hour, the candle for what she saw, and the secret for who shared it. Fletcher's voice dropped. And who was that? Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the lace curtains, where lamplight trembled beyond. The chairwoman, Mrs. Sims, the one who claimed the snow kept her away. She was here that night, I am certain of it. She'd been promised money to hide what she saw, but conscience, like snow, melts unevenly. The inspector stared at her, realization dawning. Then the candle she left burning so the charwoman could slip in later, and found instead that she had misjudged gratitude. Miss Marple sighed. Mrs. Sims used her key, panicked when confronted, and struck her. The rest-locked door, fire, missing money was the improvisation of fear. Fletcher straightened slowly. We'll find her. She took a train north this morning. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She won't run far. The guilty seldom do. The cold catches them before the law does. The two stood in silence, the clock ticking between them. Fletcher glanced toward the snow. How did you know, Miss Marple? She looked down at her hands. Because I once knew another woman who kept 2 candles burning when only one was needed. One for light and one for company. The inspector said nothing. He only nodded, leaving her to the quiet she seemed to prefer. When he had gone, Miss Marple extinguished one candle and left the other to burn. Its reflection shivered across the window, tall and thin like a secret still unwilling to die. Outside, the snow fell again, gentler now, covering everything equally. The guilty and the good alike. The night thinned toward morning, and the snow no longer fell. It drifted, aimless and tired, as though the sky had run out of purpose. Miss Marple remained in the Dorset parlor until the inspector's footsteps faded into silence. Only then did she move, her candle burning low beside the clock that had measured deceit. Its flame wavered, caught a faint draught, and leaned toward the window where the first gray suggestion of dawn had begun to spread. In the distance, the church bell gave one uncertain toll. The sound carried through the village like a memory that refused to stay buried. Miss Marple watched it with a curious tenderness, the way the world always tried to reset itself after tragedy, to smooth out the wrinkles of guilt and resume its polite rituals. Tomorrow there would be tea again, and talk, and the sweet pretense that human nature was tidy after all. By 8 o'clock, the ordinary noises of the day returned. A milk cart clattered on the frozen lane. Someone's fire crackled too vigorously, as if eager to burn away last night's whispers. Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, the faint crunch of snow beneath her boots keeping time with the ticking clock she had left behind. She was greeted by the quiet comfort of her parlor flowers on the sill, a teapot on the hob, a world in miniature where reason still prevailed. Griselda Clement arrived before noon, bringing warmth and indignation in equal measure. Jane, the inspector, says it's over. They've found the woman Mrs. Sims. She confessed. Oh, how dreadful it all sounds, and yet I can't quite believe it. Confession, Miss Marple said, is rarely a surprise to anyone except the confessor. Griselda removed her gloves with theatrical precision. She says it was an accident, poor soul. Your Mr. Fletcher believes her. Apparently Mrs. Dorset had found out she'd been stealing a few coins here and there, a bit of lace, and threatened to tell the vicar. They quarreled, and the candle fell, and It all feels so small, doesn't it? So ordinary. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Most wickedness is, my dear. That is why it's so easy to overlook. Griselda shivered. And Mrs. Price Ridley, I suppose she's cleared? Of murder, yes, but not meddling. She'll repent in her way by exaggerating her remorse until even she believes it. The younger woman sighed. What a village we are, Jane, always so ready to tidy the tragedy before it's even cool. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in reply. It is the only method by which people like us survive. We draw the curtains, rearrange the flowers, and tell ourselves the worst is over. Until the next time. A pause followed long enough for the clock on the mantel to mark a full minute of unspoken thought. Then Griselda leaned closer, voice low with the intimacy of gossip. Do you ever tire of it, Jane? Seeing through everyone? Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, the faintest twinkle beneath the serenity. My dear, I never see through people. I simply look at what they choose to hide. It's much easier than guessing at their hearts. Outside, the sky had turned the color of pewter. Children played in the snow near the churchyard, their laughter too high to belong in a place where death had so recently passed. The village, unembarrassed, continued its eternal rehearsal of propriety. By afternoon, the first wreath appeared at the Dorset gate, a careful arrangement of lilies sent by the Women's Institute. Mrs. Price Ridley herself delivered it, chin held high, contrition arranged neatly upon her face. One must honor the dead, she told Miss Marple when they met on the lane. Whatever her faults, Lavinia was one of us. One of us, Miss Marple echoed, her voice as gentle as falling snow. How very comforting that must be. Mrs. Price Ridley flushed. I meant, well, one must draw lessons from tragedy. It reminds us how fragile our respectability is. Oh, indeed, Miss Marple said. It melts under scrutiny, rather like snow upon the step. That evening, the inspector returned briefly to the village, his coat white with frost and his mood oddly subdued. All finished, he said, standing awkwardly at Miss Marple's door. We've taken Mrs. Sims to Melchester. She'll likely face manslaughter. I'd say justice is done. Miss Marple poured him tea. Justice, she repeated, is such a very elastic word, Inspector. It stretches to fit whoever happens to hold it. He regarded her over the rim of his cup. You don't think she deserved arrest? Oh, she deserves something, Miss Marple said. We all do in time. But Mrs. Dorset's real tormentor was not the thief who struck her, nor even the gossip who betrayed her confidence. It was her own longing to be thought blameless. That's the cruelest vanity of all. The inspector hesitated, then nodded, as if to concede that philosophy was not his department. You've a remarkable way of finding comfort in these things. Not comfort, Inspector. Continuity. The world would end tomorrow if people stopped making tea after murder. When he left, night had already wrapped the village in its quiet disguise. Miss Marple trimmed her candle, its flame small but steady. The snow had ceased entirely now, leaving behind a landscape so smooth it seemed to promise forgiveness. She sat by the window once more, watching the faint reflections ripple across the glass, the soft glow of the vicarage, the lamplight in the grocer's, and her own solitary flame that burned longer than the rest. Somewhere beneath that gentle calm, guilt still lingered, diluted but not gone. Time would freeze it again into gossip, into memory, into moral anecdote. The clock chimed 8. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, her thoughts moving with quiet precision. The pattern was complete. The snow, the candle, the secret each had melted in its turn, leaving only the faint warmth of understanding behind. Her knitting lay folded beside her, untouched. The world outside held its breath, as though listening for one last stitch to fall into place.